Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So this week I'm going to be playing a conversation I had with intellectual conservatism on two arguments for the existence of God, that is the moral argument and the ontological argument. I want to thank him for giving me the chance to talk to him about these arguments, as well as giving me the permission to play this interview on the podcast here. You can also find this podcast on his YouTube page as well as his Facebook page, and I'd encourage you to check that out as well, because he's got some other great content on there. He's interviewed a lot of other philosophers about other arguments for the existence of God and many similar things, so check that out if you like. And I'll just go right ahead and play this interview where I talked with intellectual conservatism about the moral argument and the ontological argument for the existence of God.
So I'm excited to be here with Phil Kallberg, who'll be introducing kind of two arguments for the existence of God today. We'll have a brief discussion of them, and I'm sure Phil can recommend, resources for future inquiry. So let me just begin by asking our guest to introduce himself.
Okay. Well, my name is Phil Kallberg. I have a master's degree in philosophy that I finished about 3 years ago now. I go around presenting philosophy papers at professional academic conferences. I just finished writing one yesterday analyzing American society and toxicity and whether or not there is such a thing as toxic masculinity. I'm going to be presenting that at the Society for Pentecostal Studies in March. They got a meeting out in Los Angeles. I run a weekly podcast called The Examine Life with Phil, where I try to apply philosophy to all aspects of life. So I'm a Christian philosopher, so I wind up doing some apologetic stuff. But I've done other stuff where I has looked at systems thinking instead of linear thinking that philosophers like me like to do. I did a whole podcast on why conspiracy theories are almost always wrong. I did a giant series on the problem of divine foreknowledge where I talked to a proponent of open theism, a Molinist, a Thomist, Calvinist, and a simple foreknowledge guy. And right now I'm in the middle of doing a big series on science, creation, and evolution, and I'm just about to wrap that up. Only got a few more people. And I've been pretty busy. Last week I even had a debate with somebody on inerrancy. So
wow.
And now I'm talking to you this week. So yeah, it's like what they say, everything happens at once. And then I'm going to have a whole month where nothing happens and everything will happen at once again. So
yeah, is that how you prefer it, or do you like kind of consistent spikes?
I would very much prefer if everything just came at me gradually, but it never does. So.
Mm. And by the way, what was your conclusion on the masculinity paper, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I could send you a copy if you like, but the basic, there isn't a simple conclusion, but roughly speaking, most people who talk of it in the media don't know what they're talking about and haven't thought about it thoroughly. There's only two possible ways you can talk of toxic masculinity consistently. You can either say there's something inherently wrong with masculine in all men, which I don't want to say for obvious reasons, and not just because I'm a man. I wouldn't want to say that about women either. Or you can say that when men tend to go bad, there's a way they tend to go bad that, while not exclusively male, women are unlikely to do. So a man would be more likely to go bad and get very violent and aggressive, where a woman's going to do that, but not very likely. Mm-hmm. And essentially I went through and then argued that, yeah, this is kind of happening more, or at least it seems to, but I think the problem is more centered in the fact that our culture routinely demeans men, and there's a lot of fatherless people in America. There's a lot of boys who essentially grew up and are not men, even though they have full-grown bodies, because they weren't raised by men. They weren't raised by fathers. Most of them probably don't even know how to be men, and in some cases it's because literally nobody ever told them how. And so that's more or less what I'm going to be arguing there. And there's actually a lot of good data to support that. I think I had something like 40 sources for this essay that I worked with. So,
yeah, and a lot of people don't like the idea that there is a way to be a man, but there are some at least basic guidelines, and the rest is kind of open. But there is a basic core. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh yeah. Definitely, men will. You see this, I think, common in many societies, as well as from well, I'm going to appeal to scripture because I'm a Christian, but men tend to necessarily take leadership positions more often, tend to be a bit more dominant and aggressive and assertive. And when that's channeled properly and used in a way that's selfless rather than selfish, that's a very, very good thing. That's why, in many senses, we have a civilization where we can live in and enjoy comforts, is because a lot of dominant, aggressive men came before us and, so to speak, made it happen, and we're living on their shoulders right now.
Sorry, my cat just came up on to the interview. Sorry.
No worry. My dog is sitting on the ground right over here because he doesn't like to be alone. So.
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah, my cat, he was just taking a nap and then he just woke up. So let's just get right into the moral argument then.
Okay.
Because we were talking a little bit about ethics and morality. So you defend William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument, correct?
Yeah. That's the one I prefer, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's very nice. It's very simple. I think
exactly.
It's not loaded with controversial premises immediately. Mm-hmm. It just gets right down to what needs to be said. So how about you introduce the argument and maybe give your best, at least, opening defense of it?
Okay. Yeah. The reason why I like something like William Lane Craig's one is because it is simple. And I think intuitively a good moral argument is simple. I was thinking about this earlier. It's kind of ironic that we're talking about the moral argument, which I think is good when it's simple, and then the ontological argument, which is necessarily extremely complicated. And I don't want to say that other versions of the moral argument don't work. I think many of them do. I just think they add needless complexity. And if you've talked to and hung out with philosophers, when there's complexity involved, they'll find a way to wiggle out of things that they shouldn't wiggle out of, which is why I like to keep it simple. So a basic three-premise argument. 1, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. 2, objective moral values exist. 3, therefore God exists. It's logically valid. And one of the reasons why I like it is the premises, the first and second premise, just kind of intuitively make sense. There's ways to argue against them, but just obviously, well, not obviously, but intuitively, if you're going to go around claiming there's evil in the world, which most sane people would recognize, then you have to say, well, there's such a thing as good, because in order for there to be evil, there has to be good. And if you're going to claim there has to be good, then there has to be some kind of standard or law or something like that whereby you can distinguish between the good and the evil. And this is a little bit more of a jump for people, but if you're going to claim there's some kind of a standard, there has to be something or possibly someone that sets that standard. And I think I heard Ravi Zacharias say it this way sometime: if you assume there's evil, don't you assume there's good? If you assume there's good, don't you assume there's a law? If you assume there's law, don't you assume there's a lawgiver? And therefore, there you go. There's objective morality is tied to God. And the second premise, that there is objective morality, that again, I think is intuitively obvious to most people. I am yet to meet anyone who's outside of high intellectual academia who would deny this. The only people I've met who would deny this are some moral and ethical philosophers and other people who are essentially seem to have been educated too much so they deny what seems obvious to everyone else. Yeah. And that's a kind of a little bit of an unfair way to say it, but I do think that a basic good philosophical principle is you should believe what your senses and your mind tell you in the absence of a good reason to doubt that. So, like, my favorite example is, right now I believe I'm talking to you, we're having a conversation and all these things. If somebody was going to try and convince me, no, Phil, you're hallucinating, you're in the Matrix or something, well, they'd need to give me some very good defeaters for that. Like, if my wife came to me and said, well, actually, I slipped a bunch of LSD into your coffee this afternoon. Well, that would be a pretty good defeater for my belief that I'm talking to you right now. But absent something like that, I'm justified in believing I'm talking to you. And I think we can turn around and apply that to the existence of objective moral values, because virtually every culture and society that I've ever looked at did believe in the objective moral values. I don't think we could ever do a survey of every human who ever lived on this, but I bet if we did, probably about 99% of them would believe in objective moral values. So I think that we have very good reason to say that is the case, and the burden would be on the people who want to deny that. They'd have to give us some very good reasons to say, here's why 99% of you are wrong. And as of yet, I haven't heard them. I've gone to philosophy conferences and read some books and tried to listen, and I haven't thought very much of the reasons why they've tried to say, here's why 99% of you are wrong.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, and what was it like? Even a while back, the Phil papers sent out a survey for philosophers, and I think 56% of them were moral realists, and then like moral relativism and nihilists or whatever, they were like in the minority compared to people really are moral realists, it seems. At least those who are consistent, maybe.
Yeah, I would say that probably even the philosophers who aren't moral realists will then like qualify their non-moral realism in such a way where it's not the same thing as like nihilism or relativism. I still would want to say, I think you're being inconsistent, but most of them probably don't want to go as far as nihilism or moral relativism. Like they'll say something like, morality is an illusion foisted on us by evolution, but it works within our social setting or something like that. So they're quasi-relativists, but not relativists in the same sense that where anything goes. They would say, well, it's not anything goes, but it's what's acceptable within our culture and within our time, and that's evolved differently than it was like 3,000 years ago or something like that. And
Okay, so let's just break down the structure of the argument now. So it's modus ponens. I know that Craig usually presents the modus tollens version. So, I mean, like, would you be willing to defend either or would you prefer sticking with the modus ponens version you presented?
Oh, I think it works fine either way. I think it's a valid argument either way. So, as they say, one man's modus ponens, another man's modus ponens. So
that's right. Yeah. All right. Well, let's just sit with the modus ponens version then. So the most common, like, first objection that people bring up when they hear an argument like this is, oh, well, what are you saying? I'm not a good person because I don't believe in God. And like, you have no idea where that conclusion came from because the argument says nothing about the person or the individual themselves. It's just if there are objective moral facts and duties, then God exists. There are objective moral values and duties, therefore God does exist, right? I mean, that doesn't say that if you don't believe in God, you're a bad person. So I'm just interested, let's just probe that reaction first and just see why do people come to that knee-jerk reaction?
It's interesting why they come to that. Partially, I think it's because they're looking for any objection, and that's one of the first things that pops into their mind. But that response just confuses ontology and epistemology, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, but for people who aren't, ontology is the study of how and why things are, what is their foundations, and epistemology is the study of how we come to know about it. And this argument it's not the ontological argument, but it's an argument about ontology. It's an argument about the way things are, which is, well, we see this objective moral realm, we perceive it, we observe it. Whence from it comes? What's its foundation? And that says nothing about whether or not you are or are not a moral person. It says, well, why are there moral things? It's a bit like thinking of, if you live in a house, does the house have a foundation? And that's, in this case of the moral system, it would be God's as the foundation for the moral system would be what this argument entails. Now, that doesn't say anything about whether or not you are a moral person, as you just said. I mean, you could go live in your house with no conception whatsoever that there's a foundation. Now, I think it'd be kind of dumb, but you could do it. You could be completely ignorant of the fact that your house has a foundation, still live in it, and have a fine, decent life there. Likewise, you could be completely ignorant of the existence of God, or even be absolutely convinced he doesn't exist, and still be fine with morality, epistemologically speaking, that is. You could still live it in as much as any human being can, relatively decent moral life, and, not go around asserting your will over others and dominating them in horribly aggressive, wrong ways.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's weird for people to think about morality ontologically. Like, people kind of nowadays, they just think, well, if I believe it to be the case, then it is the case, right? So, like, if I don't believe in God, but I'm a good person, then, well, I don't need God for morality. And that kind of, I don't need God for morality, that's kind of an equivocation, right? Because as you said, right, it's not, the epistemic question is not the same as the ontological question. And moral argument's an ontological question. So, I mean,
exactly. Yeah. That's a very common error that I've noticed people make. In fact, the debate I did with the guy on an errancy just about a week and a half ago, he was failing to make that distinction left and right. And I didn't realize it much as in the debate as I did when I listened to it afterwards. So, but yeah, that's a very common distinction that people fail to make. And I think in the case of somebody who hasn't studied philosophy and isn't like doesn't pour into this stuff like I like to, I'm willing to give them kind of a bit of grace there, because are you going to hear that distinction anywhere outside of philosophy? No, probably not.
Yeah.
But that's why it's incumbent on me to explain that when I give the argument.
Mm-hmm. So let's now get into the first premise of the argument, right? So someone might say, all right, let's look at the first premise. If objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. They might say, well, how did you get the consequent from the antecedent, right? So what is it about objective moral values and duties that makes it such that God exists, if that makes sense, right? Like how does the former provide evidence for the latter? I think you kind of phrased it, so you use Ravi Zacharias' argument.
Okay, yeah.
It's awfully close to Douglas Gavite's argument, if I'm remembering properly. So
I don't think I'm familiar with how Douglas Gavite does it, but I'll take
basically like goes up to like the lawgiver, right? And the lawgiver has to be personal, has to be perfectly good, so forth, so forth. So let's just run that down again. So what's the relationship between objective moral facts and duties and God's existence?
Well, I would say that God is the ground of all things, so therefore morality flows from him. And that's obviously not going to convince anybody, because I'm not arguing for it yet. And that would also answer the Euphoro dilemma, which says, well, if God commands it, does that make it good, or is the good beyond God somehow, and you don't want to go with either? Well, the answer to that is just say no. What's good is good because God is good, and it flows from his nature. And really, it comes down to, well, once you know that there is objective morality, whence from it comes, it has to come from somewhere. Per the principle of sufficient reason, everything has to have a reason for its existence, unless you're going to deny that, for the principle of sufficient reason, in which case you're either rational can do if somebody's going to reject that. So then let's examine what the candidates are. Well, God's a good candidate for the obvious reason that just intuitively the whole idea, as Ravi Zacharias runs through it, that makes sense. You can see that. Well, what are the other candidates? Well, you could say that maybe, as a lot of people say, evolution kind of foisted it on us for survival and reproduction. But if that was the case, then morality wouldn't be objective, because it'd be very easy to see how, if a few things had gone differently a couple million years ago, we'd have evolved a completely different morality, where we think things like rape is really good because it propagates the species, even though it's quite clearly not. It's quite clearly evil and wrong. So you don't really get objective morality from evolution. You could get something maybe, but it's not going to be objective. So that one's cut out if you agree there's objective morality. The only other reasonable candidate I've ever heard would be something kind of like Platonism, where there's some kind of abstract forms somewhere out there that are, depending on which form of Platonism you take, either not connected or some way connected to the real world, and that grounds it. And so the only real candidates are God or Platonism. And because Platonism, that would ground it. I'll grant them that. But Platonism has all kinds of problems that I don't see if you just turn around and appeal to God. So that's why I would say God's the best candidate for where objective morality comes from.
I've known some people who've argued, like, okay, look, leave aside the philosophical kind of jargon, right? Like, I just know, right, that, like, let's say it's good for me to preserve, right, my existence. I want to survive. I have these sets of desires. These desires come from evolution. Everybody also seems to have these desires, right, because we've been biologically programmed this way. So, I've heard some people, like, this is kind of like considered pseudo-objective morality, where it's like, well, everybody objectively, subjectively has, right, these same preferences or whatever. Do you think that's a sufficient response? Do you think it answers or gets us any further? Or do you, like, where could you see, like, a theist coming in and saying, wait, no, your explanation's still incomplete?
Well, I think I have two objections to that. I'll go with the easy one first. And that is that that kind of that falls into the is-ought problem, which David Hume pointed out. And I still think it's very ironic that David Hume pointed this out, because I think he's so bad on so many other things. But what that person is saying is, It is the case that if I want to live this life, I need to do these things. Therefore, morality. And that doesn't work because morality is an ought. It says you ought to be kind to people. You ought not to be mean to them. You ought to not murder, kill, rape, maim, and destroy. It's an ought. Whereas what evolution would give us is lots of ises. It would work with the laws of nature and so on and so forth. And you simply cannot get an ought from an is. Lots and lots of people have tried. Some of them have been very, very bad efforts, like the horrific one Sam Harris did in his book a few years ago. But lots of cleverer people than Sam Harris have tried, and they haven't managed to pull it off either. You simply just cannot get an ought that is a duty that you have from an is, a fact or statement of reality. And it sounds like that pseudo moral realism is trying to appeal to that, which it simply cannot do. The other one I would go with, and this is one I've been trying to work on myself, is it's an argument I'd call Paul's paradox, and I get this from Romans, where Paul says, "I don't understand myself. What I want to do, I don't do. What I do, I don't want to do." And I've just looked at this a little bit, and it seems to me that morality has this very, very odd feature where all of us feel like we ought to do things, but then we don't want to do them. And I can't for the life of me understand how that could arise through evolution. As I said earlier, you can get certain types of moral systems from evolution. You can easily get why we'd want to cooperate as a species and many other things along those lines. But how are you going to get how is evolution going to produce a system that works against itself? How are we going to get a system that says, yes, you have a desire to procreate, but don't do it too often? How are we going to get a system that says, yeah, don't murder people, that's bad, but you still want to when you get really, really angry and you think it might benefit you? It doesn't work. So there's this odd paradox in the morality and system and in humans that we see, where we both feel like we ought to do things and then we don't want to at the same time. And I haven't really developed this as much as I'd like to, but I don't see how you could account for that evolutionarily, because why would evolution select for something and its opposite at the same time? That literally defies things like natural selection.
Well, what also makes me think about, too, is like when you consider some people who say, well, let me just offer you like an explanation for morality from evolutionary psychology, right? And then they say, well, look at how chimps form their colonies. They have their own codes. They seem to have social systems, whatever. And you see something that's like morality, right? That, I mean, sure, you could say that we have a physical basis on which we act in communities, right? You could explain a lot through kind of that psychological lens, but that doesn't explain, for instance, why we think, let's say, like, you know, something violates our intuition, like, oh, I really want to steal that thing, right? And it might even be better for everybody that I steal that thing. But I have this sense of, well, it goes against maybe some kind of, I don't know, like if you're a Kantian, a categorical imperative, I start using reason, right? And then somehow this reason in itself to do the good is compelling to me. That seems to be very strange if we're just in a naturalistic world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that's one way to start it. But I mean, so I know that the immediate objection is just always going to be like, oh, psychology can explain it, whatever, you know. How would you push back on somebody who thinks you could just reduce the question of morality down to psychology and biology and that's it?
Well, again, I would say you're falling into the is-out problem, at least if you're a naturalist. Now, somebody, again, who's a Platonist or already like believes in something immaterial, maybe they wouldn't fall into this. But if you're a naturalist and turning around and appealing to psychology and biology, you're talking about states of affairs in your cells and your brain and so on and so forth, and you're trying to pull odds from that. And I want to turn around and say, no, you literally cannot do that. It's about as thoroughly established as something is in philosophy that you can't do that, because so many people have tried, because so many people want to get out of this, but nobody's pulled it off. So if that just doesn't work, because under a naturalist conception, that's all psychology is your various brain states, chemicals and things like that. And all biology is your various states, be they in your cells or your whole body and so on and so forth. So you're just trying to pull an ought from an is again.
Right. So let's move on then to maybe another objection. So someone could say, look, let's say someone denies the first premise, right? And they deny the first premise because they also deny the second premise, right? So they think that in the first place, right, objective moral values and duties just don't exist, right? And let's say when we talk about objective, we're talking about like mind independent, right? So, and that there's like a real truth value to something. So it could be true, it could be false, independent of what anybody thinks. That's what we mean by objective morality. So let's say that, you have someone like J.L. Mackie, right, who's a famous atheist philosopher. And Mackie says, look, even if there were kind of these moral properties, right, these moral facts, they would be so, his wording is queer, so out of the ordinary that it doesn't seem to make sense. Like, so one is that, what is it, that somehow the good, whatever it is, or the moral facts, it'd have to be reason giving, but then how can something physical, assuming that there's just a physical world, can be reason giving? That seems to be kind of counterintuitive. So Mackie would just say, we're all kind of under this illusion where we really believe it, but in reality, like, it's just not true. How would you respond to someone who says, look, I'm just going to bite the bullet and say, I think we're just all deluded on morality. I think that we're all in error and subscribe to like some form of error theory?
Well, the practical response, which isn't good philosophically, but it would be to point out to them, you don't live that way. You don't really believe that, because everyone acts as if there are objective moral values. Now, I'm sure Mackie would want to come back and then say, but that doesn't prove I'm right. It only proves I act that way. But I think we should be very suspicious of theories where people cannot live by them. That it doesn't prove that it's wrong, but I think that should make us suspicious. When somebody comes out and says something where it clearly doesn't work in the real world, we should immediately be suspicious of that. Again, doesn't disprove it, but I think that gives us good cause for skepticism. The other thing I would say is, well, to say that you're going to reject objective moral values because they seem so different to you, well, have you looked at quantum physics? That's really, really weird. Look at the measurement problem in quantum physics. It shouldn't exist by most standards of rationality, but it does. Does that mean I should reject quantum physics? I don't think so. And on top of that, he's kind of begging the question in favor of naturalism or some type of atheism when he does that, which is, if objective moral values do really exist, then I think it reasonably follows they probably would be very, very different than like matter and the other physical laws that we see and observe in the world, because there just would be something different about them. And so if you're going to claim that they don't exist because they're different than matter and the physical laws we observe, you're begging the question in favor of your viewpoint. So I essentially want to come back and say, well, who decides what's so weird we can't accept it? Because what seems really weird to you and what seems really weird to us now might not look so weird in 100 years. Try going back 400 years and telling the physicists then about quantum physics. They'll tell you you're insane, or at least they probably would. I haven't done that. So I don't think that's a very good standard for prima facie ruling something out like that. And on top of that, it really seems to me you're kind of begging the question in favor of naturalism when you just assume, well, it's too weird because it's too unlike the natural laws and the matter we observe. Well, of course it is. It's a different thing.
Okay, so maybe just a few last questions, and then we'll move on to the modal ontological argument. Just a funny thought came to me first. I've heard that the moral argument, it's considered the most effective for people in their conversions. Like the moral argument really speaks to them. And then for the ontological argument, a lot of people kind of the first time they hear it, they think it's stupid, but then they eventually start realizing, oh, there's something more to this. So I don't know. It's just kind of funny. We're going from the moral argument to the ontological argument.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier too. That's one of the reasons actually why I really like Craig's version of it. Not that the other ones don't work, but I think the strength of the moral argument is in its simplicity, and that in those two very simple premises are just kind of intuitively obvious to most people, unless you're a trained philosopher who's been trained to doubt them or things along those lines. I think most people in the world, you just give them this argument, they're going to go, oh yeah, I get that. That makes sense. Even if they don't believe in God and don't want to, they're going to still see the force of that argument. And that's what's really good about it. So
moving on to maybe to the last few questions about the moral argument. So I think one point that I've been trying to hit on, or at least discuss, is the question about, well, why does it have to be God who grounds morality? Why can't it be, I don't know, and then evolution, psychology? That seems to be the big question. People don't, if they're really just like being honest, right, with their intuitions, and as you brought up in the beginning, just like being consistent, right? Like if someone has a really counterintuitive kind of position, they need to defend that. They can't just say, oh, I don't have that intuition, and kind of run away with it, if that makes sense. For people, like morality, being objective, being real is just so obvious to them. So let me ask you maybe this two last questions, and then we'll move on. So the first question is, but why does it have to be God, right? And the second question is, what would you consider to be the best argument against this view, and how would you defend the moral argument against that objection?
Yeah, I really think the only real hope of defeating this would be to go with some type of Platonism. Because as I freely admitted earlier, you're going to have to ground morality in something that's not physical, and that's not a physical process, which immediately rules out evolution, psychology, and all this other stuff, and that's due to the Izzat problem. So you're left with God or something very, very much like him. I mean, we could still be a little off in our conceptions of God, and that would still work. Or you're pretty much left with Platonism. Those are the only two options. And Platonism is this idea, for people who don't know, that there is the world that we have, and then there's the more real world. So we don't live in the real world. The more real world is the world of the forms. So, and the forms, according to Plato, is what everything we see is grounded on. So, and the forms are perfect. So there's a perfect tree in the other world. There's a perfect man in this other world, and we're all pale imitations of that. And so I think, again, intuitively, you could see, oh, well, the forms could ground an objective morality, because Plato's claiming they ground everything. That would totally work. And yeah, it would. But I think Platonism has all kinds of problems that are much harder to overcome than simply biting the bullet and affirming God. So, like, for example, traditionally, in pretty much every theistic religion I'm aware of, God's regarded as personal. He's a thing that's at least a little bit like us, obviously infinitely more, infinitely greater, but God is a person like you and me. He's kind of like us. Where the forms, according to Plato, are nothing like us at all. They're so disconnected from us. It's like comparing the material to the immaterial. They're necessarily contradictory, the material and the immaterial. Well, it's probably even a little worse for the forms because of how unlike us they are. So how do you get any kind of connection between the two? I've heard some people call Platonism extreme realism because. And the objection is there that it confuses the abstract, that is, these forms, morality, and so on, and so, numbers and other abstract things, with the concrete, the real things we literally do see, and applies more meaning to the abstract than it does to the concrete. It gets it backwards, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I would say to somebody who wants to go to Platonism, that's probably your best bet, but I don't think you can overcome all these problems. And in fact, the only way I've ever seen anybody try to, I think, successfully overcome all the problems with Platonism is to bring God into the mix and use it all together, which, well, that doesn't help you if you're the atheist naturalist. So,
Well, another thing, too, is in William Lane Craig's debate with Eric Wielenberg, I think Craig made like a really awesome point. He said something like, okay, so on Wielenberg's view, like this kind of godless normative realism, you have like this abstract property that gets associated with this act, right? But by some kind of supervenience, you know.
Exactly.
But the question is, why is it that property and not another property? Like, why is it that when I show love and affection or I show kindness, that those properties are super, kind of imposed onto the world? Why not? And then Craig uses like numbers or some other kind of property, right? So you already need some kind of limiting principle. And it seems like the best limiting principle would be a rational intellect.
Something that's personal, that can make decisions and decide, as opposed to like some kind of impersonal law, which would give you then good cause to go, oh, well, maybe this is God or something really, really like it.
And the relations between like the properties and the acts would be totally accidental, so you wouldn't even really have like an objective system of morality. It would just be kind of like you flip the coin and see what your act is or whatever, It doesn't seem like our world.
Yeah, it'd be kind of hard to see how they're actually objective in that if it's accidental.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's now go to the modal ontological argument. So this argument, this argument really divides not only atheists and theists, but also a lot of Christians or a lot of theists that I know. Because a lot of them are like, oh yeah, this argument's amazing. Others of them are like, this is stupid. Why would anyone accept this? And, it's kind of like, wow, why is this argument so divisive? So you're going to use Plantinga's version of the modal ontological argument. So just give us the rundown, give us a brief case, and then we'll dive right in.
Okay, yeah. Plantinga's version is probably the most accessible. That's also technically good. I have looked at and Gödel's version, and many people have told me that one's actually better, but good luck understanding it without some deep dives into modal and symbolic logic, where Plantinga's one, I think anybody can at least begin to grasp what's going on. So basically the idea of Plantinga's one is, number one, it's possible that God exists. Number two, if it's possible that God exists, then he exists in some possible world. If God exists in, hang on, I messed that up there. If God exists in, and he's defining God as a maximally great being. So if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds, because obviously a being that exists in two possible worlds is better than one that exists in one that exists in three is better than one that exists in two, and so on ad infinitum. So you just say a maximally great being would exist in all possible worlds. Well, the actual world, the world we live in, is a possible world. Therefore, a maximally great being, i.e. God, exists in the actual world. Therefore, God exists. And there's some other more technical ways he's talked about that. Like he gave the first version of it in, I think, The Nature of Necessity. He gave a bit of a simplified and easier to follow version at the end of God, Freedom, and Evil. And if that's where I'd recommend people actually start if they're wanting to read the source material on that. I read that back in college and had to read it like 3 or 4 times before I started to understand it. It can be a difficult book to read, but you're better off starting there than in Nature of Necessity, because if you haven't studied philosophy, that will drive you away. So don't start with that. So.
All right. Well, so there's a lot that we could go on there. I mean, it's surprising because the argument's it's devilishly simple, and some people say it's clever or whatever. So
it's definitely clever. Whether or not, even if it doesn't work, it's a clever argument, no doubt about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the first idea that people get when they hear this argument, they have a suspicion. They're like, oh, you just defined God into existence, right? So you said if it's possible that there is this being who cannot fail to exist, right? Then, well, the debate just ends there, right? You're just defining God into existence. You haven't shown that he actually exists. You're just saying, hey, let me load up this concept with all these properties and say that it has to exist. And then, aha, I have God, right? So, I mean, what would you say to someone who has the suspicion that the ontological argument just defines God into existence, supposedly?
Well, I would say you don't understand one of two things. You either don't understand the argument, or you don't understand how logical arguments work in general. Because in a certain sense, I could turn around and say that Aristotle's classic argument about Socrates, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I could say that defines Socrates into being mortal by saying, well, all Aristotle did there is define men as mortal right there in the first premise. So didn't he just define Socrates into being mortal? And most people would want to kind of balk at that, and they should, because that's dumb. Obviously, that's wrong. And it's similar to that with the ontological argument. The distinction here is, though, that where Aristotle's argument had 2 distinct premises, the ontological argument really only has one premise, which is it's possible that God exists, and then you're applying modal logic, axiom S5 to it. And so if modal logic axiom S5 is valid, then it totally works. It's a valid argument, and you're not defining anything into existence. It just looks a little odder because it's essentially a single premise argument, and those are rare and kind of weird. You don't really get taught single premise arguments in intro to philosophy classes for very good reasons, because then nobody would take intro to philosophy classes. So,
well, and could you also define what modality is for those who are not familiar?
Absolutely good idea. Yeah, modality is just the study of what it means for something to be possible and what it means for something to be necessary. So, and that's why we use the language of possible worlds when we're talking about this. So a necessary thing would be something that cannot fail to exist or necessarily follows from something. So in a deductive argument, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, or here's a way I like to explain it. If I've baked you a cake, you know that necessarily at some point in the past, the ingredients existed for that cake because there's a necessary relationship between a cake and its ingredients. You never get a cake without ingredients, at least in some way, in some sense. And so those are easy examples of that. And it's similar with possibility, where there's all kinds of things that are possible but just don't actually exist. It's possible in the sense that there's nothing incoherent about it to say, well, Hillary Clinton could have won the last election in America, because that certainly could have happened. And it's even possible for very, very weird things to happen that don't happen. Like maybe next time Donald Trump answers the press, he decides to stand on his head while answering the questions. Well, that's coherent and possible. It's never going to happen, but that's possible. And so modal logic is this study of how all these different types of concepts, possibility, necessity, relate to each other. And when you get deep into it, there's several different types of necessity. There's different types of possibility, and people come up with various types of theorems and axioms. Axiom S5 is one of them, where they're trying to essentially puzzle this out. And one of the nice things about modal logic is it did not arise for philosophy of religion and apologetics. It was purely the study of logic that led rise to it, and then only later did Planck and some others turn around and go, oh, wait, we could really make use of this for the ontological argument. And so I could be a little mistaken about this, but I don't think anybody really questioned the validity of S5 before it started getting used for the ontological argument. And in the study I've done of this, axiom S5, which represents the logic that's going on in the modal ontological argument, is generally pretty well regarded by people who do modal logic as the way to go. They say, yeah, this is valid, this works, it's the way to go. There are a few dissenting voices, but even the dissenting voices I read would say, I'm dissenting, almost everyone disagrees with me. So,
yeah. All right. Well, we can move on then to the question of what is a maximally great being. So it seems like the argument, so some people might say, why not instead say it is possible that there is a metaphysically necessary being, right? Why do we have to say it has to be a maximally great being? How is the argument defining that in terms of the argument that it's setting forward? How is it defining maximal greatness?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question, actually, but I'll do my best here. So I think you can flesh maximal greatness out in a couple different ways. St. Anselm was hitting on this idea when he called God something than which nothing greater can be thought. I know some philosophers will prefer to speak in terms of perfection or absolute perfection instead of maximal greatness. Others go the route of going with great-making properties and trying to add them all together. So the idea of a great-making property is that for some property, God would be greater if he had it than if he didn't have it. So God is great. A God who knows everything is greater than a God who only knows some things, and so on and so forth. And then given that God is the greatest possible being, God must have this property of knowing everything. And so there's technical reasons that you can prefer one of these methods over the other. I think maximal greatness is an easier and less problematic conception than absolute perfection. But all these are trying to get at the same idea, that of the ultimate thing with a capital U, or as Anselm said, that than which no greater thing can be conceived. Although even Anselm's there, I think, is a little limited because he's limited by what we can conceive. And I think we would want to say, well, it has to be greater than even what we can conceive. So, and part of the point here is maximally great being, pretty much by definition, would have to be God. There really isn't anything else it could be. And so I say you kind of almost want to think of it as kind of like an X in an algebra equation, where you know it represents something real, but you can't nail it down exactly, because that's in many senses what God is. Even as we talk about him and study him and do our best with theology, you can't nail down God exactly. And anybody who says they can clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. So does that help you answer the question? Because I know it's a difficult one to it's actually difficult to really analytically define maximally great being. That's one of the problems, and that's why we use all these various terms to get at it. So,
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. And maybe one thing that would be important for the audience to know too is what the ontological argument seems to need. And I know like there's been a lot of debate on this, so I'm just kind of going at it from what I've understood. Like, for instance, like in some possible world, a unicorn could exist. There's nothing logically incoherent about a unicorn existing in some possible world.
Yeah, seems so.
But there's nothing about it that makes it have to exist in every possible world, including the actual world. I mean, and the same could be true of like myself or of other human beings, right? There's some possible world where I don't exist. There is a possible where maybe I do exist, and it just so happens to be the case that it's the actual world, right? But it's conceivable that I did not have to exist.
Exactly, yeah.
So then the ontological argument is just saying, look, it's coherent for there to be a being who has necessary existence and all these other properties, right? And they don't have to conflict. And I mean, why, if it's logically consistent, then we don't have to stop the buck, right? Like it could be the whole package. It could be God. And if it could be God, then it is God.
Yeah.
That's kind of the brilliance of the argument.
Exactly. Yeah. If it works in the sense of maximal greatness, it essentially gets you the God that all Christians want to argue for. You can do a bit of a weaker version where you take out the maximal greatness and just say it's a necessary being, and the logic still works. Because a necessary being, if something is necessary, it exists in all possible worlds. There is no possible world where you can make a cake without ingredients. That's impossible. There's a necessary relationship there. There are worlds where there are no ingredients, and there are possible worlds where there are no ingredients and there are no cakes, but there is no possible world where you can get a cake without ingredients. It just doesn't work that way. So, yeah, you can make the logic work only on necessity, but that's not near as interesting to do because that doesn't get you the God everyone wants to argue for.
Right. So, I mean, one thing that you could say, though, or one thing that I've heard people object to is, well, look, there are all these problems when you say that there is this kind of God that exists, right? So is it possible for God to create a stone so heavy that he can't lift, right? All these paradoxes of omnipotence and other things. I'm just interested, so Yuji Nagasawa kind of talks about like the maximal compatible set of all the properties, right? So do you think that's a possible road, or do you really think we could like preserve, like, okay, yeah, God, like, what's your take on the properties of God and harmonizing and avoiding the paradoxes?
Well, I like, his approach is actually very clever. Yugen Nagasawa. Did I pronounce his name correctly? I know
Eugen.
Yeah. Okay. I know who you're talking about because I've looked at some of his stuff, but I haven't actually met him, so I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, and my apologies. But yeah, that's a clever approach where what he basically says is, okay, people will claim that, hey, there's like a conflict between God's omnibenevolence and his omnipotence that we see manifested by the problem of evil. And he'll say essentially, okay, let me just give that to you, and I'll back off a little bit on one of these traits, so then you don't have the problem. I'll say something like, well, yeah, God is omnibenevolent, but he just isn't quite as powerful as we think, so he actually can't stop all evil. Well, then you're still left with essentially what is the maximally great being that could exist, and he's going to say, and that's still God, and I can still essentially run an ontological argument for him. At least I think he does. I've only really heard him talk about maximal God, but I think he wants to run an ontological argument for it. And that's clever because it's essentially saying, well, if I give you that, I may have to change my theology a bit, and I'm going to have problems with some like Christian denominations that say God is omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and so on and so forth, because I'm going to have to deny the creed they're going with. But I'm still going to get something very much like God. I'm still going to get something that's infinitesimally more powerful than you or I, even if it's not omnipotent. And so, yeah, that's clever. But in one sense, I kind of think it depends on what he's trying to do. If he's just trying to say, look, as a tactical position, even if I give you what you want, it's not going to get you what you want. Great. That's a good way to argue. Just assume something for the sake of argument to demonstrate it doesn't go where you want it to go. So say to the atheist who's arguing that, well, this conception of God has all these problems, you can turn around and say, well, look, even if I give you what you want, I'm still going to be able to argue for of something very, very much like God, not really quite a God with a small g, but not a God with a capital G, something in between. I know you don't want that, so why go this route? But then on the other hand, like, I've tried to read into some of these claims that, like, there's some contradiction in the concept of God, and I've just never been able to find a good substantiation of it, because prima facie, I just can't see any contradiction between God being omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, necessary, and all these other traits that people want to give to him. The only possible candidate that I'm really aware of would be things like the problem of evil and the problem of divine foreknowledge, which are big problems and big issues. But even there, I haven't really seen anybody demonstrate the logical contradiction, the incoherence. I've seen them give some very good appeals that make me really question things and really tug on my emotions, but I haven't ever seen anybody go, see, there's the connection. Here's why God's like a married bachelor or a square circle. Mm-hmm. Here's where it says -1. Here's where it says +1, and never the two shall meet. I haven't seen it. And I haven't read everything everybody's ever done on this, but I've tried to be somebody with my ear to the ground, and I just haven't seen it.
Well, that's kind of my impression, too. Most people object to kind of the structure of the argument and not so much the concept of God directly. So they try to say, like, and this kind of maybe could lead to our next question, right? Where, like, you could have this concept of God, but you actually, like, okay, so there are two questions here. One is that, well, okay, here's the problem with your argument, right? Problem is this. I could prove anything into existence, a maximally great unicorn, a maximally great island, right? So there's no limit. So why does it have to be God? The other question that some people have raised is, well, look, you haven't actually shown that God exists, right? So it's kind of, when the person makes this argument, I think they're saying, look, what we're basically saying is, I think the accusation would be something like it's circular, or like it's already, presupposing its conclusion or whatever. It's, I don't know, begging the question. That's what some people would say, right? Mm-hmm. So, because, I'm not sure exactly how some of those people have made those arguments, but those are two common accusations. So one is you're begging the question. The other one is this argument has no limit. I could have a maximally great anything. How would you respond to those two objections?
Okay, well, let's take them one at a time. The first one is you absolutely cannot prove a maximally great anything with this argument. You only can prove a maximally great being, which has to be God. If your unicorn was maximally great, the unicorn would be God. If your island was maximally great, it would be God. And in effect, it's not a unicorn or an island anymore, because a unicorn is by definition a contingent thing. It comes into existence, it goes out of existence, it can die, it can be killed, etc., etc., etc. An island is by definition a contingent thing. It comes into existence usually because, like, a volcano erupts and builds up, and then one day it probably goes out of existence as plate tectonics and the ocean wash it away, even if it takes a very, very long time. So what those people are essentially doing there is they're kind of playing with definitions, and some of them, I don't know if they're doing this maliciously or some aren't. There's a very funny clip of William Lane Craig talking with the philosopher Louis Wolpert on YouTube, where Wolpert does this, where he essentially says, oh, well, it's a really great computer. And Craig's like, well, but a computer isn't self-existent. Wolpert's like, oh, this computer is. And Craig goes, well, a computer isn't timeless. Oh, this computer is. And eventually Craig's like, look, all you're doing is making this computer into God. Mm-hmm. If you give this computer all these properties of God, it's God. And sure, then I'll grant you, that works. But you've just turned it into God. So, you can't use it to prove a maximally great anything. I'm a little more sympathetic to people who claim that when they look at Anselm's original version of the ontological argument, because that probably was susceptible to parodies, but modal versions are not susceptible to parodies like this. And how they got started, I don't know. Maybe somebody looked up Anselm's original one and realized, oh, this isn't a terribly good argument, and they forgot to read all the contemporary discussion on modal ontological arguments. So the second one you mentioned was begging the question, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. This is one that I think gets accused all the time because of its nature as a single premise argument. And single premise arguments are weird. They're not the way we normally think about things. So begging the question, as you said, means assuming what you set out to prove. Now, in most arguments, you're going to have two or more premises, and the conclusion is buried within those premises. We see that in Aristotle's example, where the fact that Socrates is mortal is buried in those two premises: all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Whereas since the modal ontological argument, at least Plantinga's version, only has one premise, that means the conclusion has to be in that single premise. And so I think that's where this accusation comes from, which is you're pulling something out of only one premise, where in most other arguments you're doing it out of two premises or more. However, wouldn't say this is begging the question. I can see how it would appear that way, because this is kind of like how if you see a red Ferrari from a Lamborghini, or Ferrari from a distance, and then you see a red Lamborghini from a distance, and you're not very familiar with cars, you could confuse them because they look very much alike, but they're not the same thing. And in this case, begging the question kind of looks a bit like what the ontological argument is doing, but it's not the same thing. The distinction is all the modal ontological argument is doing is taking that one premise, it's possible that a maximally great being exists, and then applying the logic of modal logic axiom S5 to it. And as I said, virtually almost everybody that I've ever read agrees S5 works. I think some people have said you could even do a modal ontological argument with S4, but it's a little more difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So it's not invalid. It's more like doing an immediate inference. It's kind of like if you say to me, hey, it's raining outside, and I go, oh, therefore water's coming from the sky. Well, did I define water for coming from the sky into existence, or did I beg the question? Well, no, I made an immediate inference from what I know about what it means for it to be raining outside. And that's more like what the ontological argument is doing. Mm-hmm. And so I can sympathize with how it appears that way to them if they haven't studied it in depth, if they just heard it offhand somewhere, because it is a complicated, difficult, and weird argument. But no, it's not begging the question.
The other thing I think about, too, is maybe people think it begs the question because, like, in the second premise, it says if it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, the first premise is, like, it's possible that a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Mm-hmm. And they might think in their head, well, as soon as I concede that point, I can just see how it follows, right? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
And it's kind of like, well, that's the point, right? Mm-hmm. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
It's possible that you have such a being like this, then it just follows that it goes from the possible to the actual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've presented papers at essays at two conferences now, where I've attempted to argue what the ontological argument at the very least does is it forces you into one of two categories. You have to say God is necessary and therefore exists, or God is impossible and therefore he cannot exist. He is impossible. You're essentially, I think, stuck trying to say there's something incoherent about God or God exists. And it forces you into one of those two positions is what I see. There's the only real good denial is to say God's impossible. And if you're not going to say that, then you pretty much have to affirm God exists.
Well, and the other thing is, too, like, Ben Arbour kind of talks about if you're just like a really modest person, like if you don't go into this debate super biased, right? Like, it seems like the more modest position is, well, look, okay, fine, it's possible that God exists. Because the other claim, like, it's just impossible that God exists. That's an extremely strong claim. Yeah, it hasn't been substantiated at all. But the mere possibility of God's existence, that's doable. And because it's doable, you can take it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've had the pleasure of talking to Ben about that. And I hadn't thought of that before he said that, but I think that's a good point. Saying something is possible does seem to be a more modest claim than saying something is impossible, because you have to demonstrate, let me rephrase that. It's easier to demonstrate that something's possible than it is to demonstrate that something's impossible.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's do one last question, then I think we can end there.
Okay.
So Immanuel Kant has a very famous critique of the ontological argument where he says existence is not a predicate, right? So he would say something like, if a triangle exists, then it has three sides, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the most that I can get from saying, like, what is it? Like, just because I know the properties of the thing or something like that doesn't make it suddenly come into existence, right? If I'm not mistaking that. Kant would say something like, you haven't actually established that you know that God exists or that God exists. It's kind of, and it's still an if that makes sense. Like, if God exists, then he would have such and such properties, but you haven't shown that he does have such and such properties, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I would say I've got the full quote he did there, but I don't think I'll read it because it's Kant was a terrible writer, and it would bore people. But you can go look it up if you want. Let me see here. It was in Critique of Pure Reason. The copy I have of that, it's on page 567 if anybody wants to look it up. But my short response is Kant's claim that existence is not a predicate or a property. It's ridiculous and extremely problematic. So let me go through my notes here. So I think we could say fairly that Kant's point here is that you cannot simply define things into existence. That is, I can take the concept of $100 million in my mind, add existence to it, and suddenly have $100 million because, hey, if I could do that, I'd have done it a whole long time ago, who wouldn't? Mm-hmm. And in this regard, Kant's exactly right. But this isn't what the ontological argument is trying to do, and it's worth noting that Kant predates modal logic. He didn't have access to this version of the argument we're working from. As Plantinga explains, if this had been the procedure that we're working with the ontological, if Plantinga says, and I quote, if this were Anselm's procedure, he would simply have added existence to a concept that has the application contingently, if at all. Then indeed his argument would be subject to the Kantian criticism. But he did not, and it is not. The trouble is here that with God, Plantinga and Anselm have not taken a contingent thing and added existence to it like I want to do with $100 million, and I'm sure you do. Rather, what they're doing is considering the implication of what it means for a thing to be necessary or maximally great. Now, we can still argue about the argument other ways, like say, well, this concept doesn't work. There's something incoherent about it. So let me, a gentleman named Jerome Schaeffer summarized here how astonishingly bad Kant's argument is. He says, it's astonishing that this argument has stood for so long and is still commended by philosophers. For the argument, if sound, shows that nothing could be a real predicate. Suppose I wish to say that something is red, where red is intended as a real predicate, and predicate means property for people who aren't familiar with philosopher speak. In asserting that the thing is red, I would be adding my concept to the thing, and hence would be unable to say that the object as originally conceived is red, that the exact object of my concept is red. The argument which shows that exists is not a real predicate also shows that nothing could be one. In a sense, Schaeffer did a reductio ad absurdum of Kant's argument there and said, but if you're right, we can't really say anything is a property because we're always adding properties of stuff in our mind. Like, I just met you. Let's suppose we finish our conversation and then I learned something else about you. Like, I don't know where you live. So suppose I find out somewhere or other what state you live in or something like that. Well, did I just add that concept, that predicate of you into my mind? It certainly seems so, but that's exactly what Kant's saying I can't do. So, yeah, I don't think very much of this objection at all. It's kind of astonishing to me that people run to it because existence seems to be one of the most obvious properties we have. It's very difficult to define it, but you and I both exist. The computers we're using to talk on exist. My dog exists. Your cat exists. The sun exists. There's something at least a little alike about all of us in that we all exist. Now, I had somebody object to me one time when I talked about this saying, but we all have it in common, so therefore it can't be anything. And I was like, what? Come on. No, that doesn't make sense. All human beings have the property of being human in common. That doesn't mean there's nothing human about us. That doesn't mean that isn't a property. So the fact that all these things have existence in common doesn't mean it isn't a property. Now, the properties... Existence is hard to define analytically. It's very difficult to actually get a good, rigorous philosophical definition of it because everything we see holds it in common. But it doesn't follow from that it isn't a real thing. It's one of the most basic things that seems to be. And again, there I'd want to appeal to my conservative philosophical system, which says, hey, when you see something, unless you've got good cause to doubt it, go ahead and believe it, especially if virtually every other human being agrees with you. And virtually every other human being certainly sees things that exist. So,
well, I want to thank you, Phil, for this conversation tonight. So we discussed the moral argument, the modal ontological argument. I think one thing that has fascinated me about arguments for the existence of God, kind of, when I first started off doing philosophy, I was kind of looking for like a knockdown, irrefutable proof of the existence of God. And then over time, I started noticing like, wait, I think sometimes maybe people expect philosophy to do more than what it can actually
definitely
provide, So like to get to the God of Christianity, or to get to theism, or even to remotely accept deism, I think that there are other things that are going to compel you, and a reason, of course, is one powerful thing that can move you. So what would you say, aside from the arguments you presented, like so it could be another intellectual argument, but what has motivated you to believe in God, or what is what grounds your faith? And I'll close off with that question.
Oh, well, I actually, if you go to my podcast, The Examine Life with Phil, I did my very first podcast on that and how it got me into philosophy. I tell an hour-long story there, so I won't repeat it here, but it is. I grew up in a Christian family, good Christian family, great parents and everything like that. And then when I was in the military, I went through what I didn't know what. I wouldn't have used this term then, but now I would call it an existential crisis, where I started questioning all these things I'd grown up to believe in, like, well, does God really care about me? Why do all these bad things happen? And that prompted me to get into going to very, very good stories and philosophy and starting to realize this. And so that's been the ground of it. And when I do doubt, I have doubts, my mind immediately does go to philosophical arguments. Like the one that gives me, I'd say, the most confidence is actually a version of the cosmological argument. I'm sure you're going to be talking to more people about that one. But that one, the first time I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, there's got to be God or something really, really like him at the beginning, at the ground level of all this. I think that argument really does a solid on that. But the moral argument I like that one because it actually gets me something that's good, as opposed to just something that could be anything, like you can get with the cosmological argument. And I do like what you're saying there, that people tend to want more from philosophy than it can give. I haven't formulated this into a principle, but I think a good rule of thumb is, if you see an argument that gives you everything you want right away in like 3 or 4 simple steps, you should be highly suspicious of that argument. There's probably something wrong with it. Because argumentation doesn't tend to work that way. It tends to go by, good argumentation doesn't tend to go that way. It's a slow, methodical process that takes a lot of work. So somebody comes to you and says, oh, I can give you everything you want arguing in 4 steps. They probably can't. Maybe it's something nobody's ever heard of before, and they're the smartest person who's ever lived, but I kind of doubt it. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Phil, for that story. And I really appreciate having you on the show. And what was your podcast again? The Examine Life with Phil, is that correct? Or
it's called The Examine Life with Phil. As far as I know, you can find it on all the podcast services like iTunes, Spotify, and so on and so forth. I got a Facebook page I made for the podcast. Just type in The Examine Life with Phil. I put up stuff there every time I got a new podcast, and I try to put up funny or interesting things throughout the week, like philosophy jokes or comments and things like that I think are important. And I love interacting with people. One of my favorite parts of that is when people write in and say, no, you were wrong this week when you tried to give somebody a Facepalm and Sigh award for making a really stupid argument. They were actually right, and I just love interacting with people when they contact me that way. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to wish you a good night, Phil. Thank you for coming on to Intellectual Conservatism. Please check out Phil's podcast and his page on Facebook. I think I follow it, actually. So great content. I really appreciate you taking time out of your night.
Thank you for having me. Very much enjoyed it.
Okay, so that's the extent of the interview I did with him on these 2 arguments. As always, let me know what you think. Would you like to know more about either of these arguments? Like me to go even more in depth? Write and let me know what you think. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. Or, as he mentioned there in the interview, I've started a Facebook page for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a quick search for it. You can find it. And as always, I encourage you, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, share it on your social media, get it out to more people, give me a like or a rating or whatever is appropriate on the podcast app you use so we can get the algorithms working and get the podcast out to more people. Write and let me know what you think. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back again with another thing for y'all next week.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.